In late summer and autumn of 1888, the area of Whitechapel and Spitalfield in the East End of London was riven by a series of notorious murders, which were subsequently, not necessarily correctly, ascribed to the hand of a single killer. We don't know who he was, but posterity has labelled him Jack the Ripper. Now, we have to bear in mind that the science of forensics, police work and detection, aside obviously from the tremendous skills which I myself, as Sherlock Holmes, with my colleague Dr. Watson, exhibit, police work was, to say the least, in its infancy. And forensic work, in the way you might understand it now, barely existed at all. Whitechapel was the perfect breeding ground for crime. And indeed, crime of all sorts flourished in the warren of streets and houses and jumbled buildings, factories, tanneries, slaughter yards, every form of industrial activity that you can imagine. And the people who lived there were a maelstrom of races. Many had escaped Tsarist oppression in Eastern Europe. There were many who came from the Middle East, who had discharged sailors. There were many women, unfortunate women, who, in order to feed their addiction to gin, were obliged to sell their bodies on the streets. And it was from these unfortunates, these soiled doves, these fallen women, that the man they called the Ripper chose his victims. Much mystery surrounds the man. Indeed, he was a man, or men. Who he was, which stratum of society he came from, we do not actually know. It was in Buck's Row, Whitechapel, in the early hours of the 31st of August 1888, that the body of Mary Ann Nichols was found. She is believed to be the first victim of this mysterious killer, the man we call Jack the Ripper.
Oh, Holmes, the game's afoot, as we say.
Indeed.
My God, this is the work of the very devil. He's gutted her. Alimentary, dear Holmes. Is,
yes, sir.
As we say. You'll note her throat is severed to the bone with 2 deep cuts, and the jagged single thrust to the abdomen. Actually, I think the perpetrator would be a right-handed man, someone familiar with bodies. I suspect maybe a surgeon or a butcher, we could speculate. And I think it was likely that the perpetrator was known to the victim. He worked fast, and there's no defensive wounds.
Great.
I suspect as well he was not in favour of the women having the vote.
Barely a week after the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, the corpse of Annie Chapman was found at 29 Hanbury Street, again in Whitechapel, and in the early hours of the morning. She too had been murdered. Dr. Holmes and Watson will examine the body and discuss the wounds, but we do know that a witness stated that before she was killed, obviously, they had seen the victim in the company of a man who they described, rather vaguely it has to be said, as shabby but genteel. Watson.
It's another inhuman crime, Holmes. Inhuman. Is it the same fellow, do you think?
I would say almost certain. If we look, the same modus operandi. Deep lateral slash to the throat, partial evisceration. I believe our killer becomes more bold. I think we will find that part of her uterus has been removed.
Disgusting. Disgusting. He must be absolutely drenched in blood, surely.
And yet, nobody seems to see him. Watson.
Well, he must wear some sort of outer garment, one easily hidden.
Look around us, Watson. Look around this place. What trades do we see represented here?
Butchers, Holmes. Butchers. And they all wear leather aprons.
Quite so, Watson. If you want to hide in plain sight. Hide among the crowd. Simply blend in. Our killer knows his turf, and he escapes. Not because he is obvious, but because he is so ordinary. That is how he eludes us for the moment. On the 30th of September, the killer raised his game. First, the body of Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, again of course in Whitechapel. This time she had been killed by a single incision to the neck, but there was no other mutilation or damage to the body. The supposition was perhaps this was a different killer, a copycat killer, or it was the original killer who had been disturbed in the act. Now, witnesses said they believed that they had seen the victim, Stride, with a man some short time before her probable time of death. Some described him as fair, some described him as dark, some described him as shabby, some as genteel. Watson?
Holmes, this creature seems invisible.
And yet he is not a phantom. We see his work all about us.
A different killer?
I think not. I think more likely his sport was disturbed. He had only time to murder his victim in the habitual manner, but not time to carry out those abominable mutilations which seem now to be becoming his trademark.
Did not an earlier witness describe a sort of shabby genteel man with the victim earlier?
This is very right. This is correct, Watson. Shabby but genteel. Now, what does that tell us about our killer, would you say?
Someone who wasn't shabby at all?
Absolutely. You begin to detect my method, Watson. I'm gratified. See, our man, I don't think was shabby. If he was of the lower sort, he would dress up to look like a toff. The middling sort might dress as an artisan. But who will make himself more shabby than he is? A gentleman, I would say.
Someone who isn't shabby at all.
Exactly.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. See, I think he comes here by carriage, probably his own. He picks out his victim, he stalks her, he gains her attention, he moves away with her, and then he strikes. Possibly, just possibly, as we see no evidence of any defensive wounds, just possibly, they are previously acquainted. And then when he strikes like a cobra.
Extraordinary. Who, Holmes? Who?
That is what we have to find out, Watson. Everyone in London is talking. Is it a member of the royal family? Is it Lewis Carroll? Is it any surgeon in London? Is it a butcher? We really, really do not know. Not yet. But I'll make one prediction for this night, 30th of September. He has not yet finished. Later that same evening, 30th of September, not too far from where the body of Elizabeth Stride had been found, the body of Katherine Eddos was also discovered in Mitre Square. This time, the Ripper had had more leisure to complete his work. And with each killing he grew bolder. This time he had not been surprised. This time the victim again had died from wounds to the throat, but this time she had been more fully eviscerated. Her uterus and indeed part of her kidney were gone. Watson?
Clearly this time our man had greater leisure, Holmes. Disgusting.
You will see, Watson, how his method improves with every time. He grows bolder. He grows more certain.
It's of our business, Holmes. Not only is her throat cut and her abdomen open, but actually several of the internal organs have been removed.
Indeed they have, Watson. Her uterus, part of her kidney. And of course you remember there is that dreadful business to come with the famous From Hell letter, where somebody avers that he is Jack and indeed has fried and eaten his victim's kidney, though we now know that to be
disgusting, despicable crime
a trick.
By a phantom.
A phantom. And yet, Sir Charles Warren of Scotland Yard, the Commissioner of Police, found some evidence at Goulston Street.
Come along now, gentlemen, move along. Nothing to see here.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it, Sir Charles? You removed the evidence, did you not? You had wiped from the wall the Goulston Street graffiti, which was found beside a part of the victim's apron, which would clearly link the crimes. And the graffiti, as I remember from the brief moment we had to look at it, said, the Jews are not the ones who will be blamed for nothing. Jews was misspelt, Jews. Now, whether this was simple malice or whether this was some coded clue from the killer, we don't know.
Not evidence, Mr. Holmes. Sedition and incitement. Why, such things might cause a riot. There's enough tension in Whitechapel as it is. It is my job to keep a lid on it. Besides which, there's nothing to link this now to the case, is there?
No, not now you've wiped it off.
Come, Watson. We still have work to do. On the 9th of November, 1888, at 13 Miller's Close, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was found. Now, she was 25, much younger than the rest. Shakespeare once said, "Confusion now hath made his masterpiece." And Mary Jane Kelly was the masterpiece of Jack the Ripper. She was killed inside, in the squalid, one-roomed tenement in which she lived. Her throat was cut. Her face was mangled. She had been completely eviscerated, her organs spread out like an anatomical lesson, and her heart was removed.
It's made a masterpiece, Holmes, a masterpiece of crime. I've never seen anything quite so frightful.
This time he had all the leisure that he required.
Well, he damn near decapitated her. The man must be consumed by a devilish passion.
So he's not a Liberal Democrat then?
Well, there's talk of the Freemasons.
And the Rotary clubs, and just about every other type of association you could imagine. The royalty, as I've said, the artist Walter Sickert apparently is quite a prime suspect. The fact is, we have no suspects, none at all, which is devilish strange.
Well, he's the very devil incarnate. I've clearly never heard of work to rule. Clearly not a trade union.
Presumably not. No, Watson. I think this goes to the very top, of our society. I begin to get a whiff of conspiracy.
I like it when you say that, Holmes, as well, for it is good for sales. As you know, I've been taken to penning your memoirs, so you can't beat a good conspiracy. So how far do you think it stretches?
Oh, Watson, I think this one goes to the very top. The very top, indeed. And this wretched young woman is possibly the last victim. In fact, Mary Jane Kelly seems to have been the last victim of the killer called Jack the Ripper. There are no more definite or confirmed killings to his name. It wasn't until 1894 that the Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, also as head of CID, Sir Melvick McNaughton, actually began to use the idea of a single serial killer. He believed that the murders were all committed by one perpetrator. The police surgeon at the time backed him up on that. But the plain fact was, conspiracy or no conspiracy, Jack was never caught. A theory is that the perpetrator committed suicide at about the time the canonical killing stopped. There may have been later copycat killings. Inspector Aberline of the Metropolitan Police went to New York a couple of years after the Ripper killing ceased here, because a couple of victims in New York were thought possibly to have been the victims of the same murderer. As it turned out, Aberline felt that they probably weren't. And so Jack the Ripper, with all his notoriety, disappears into history, along with Whitechapel itself. The whole area was redeveloped. The whole Victorian huddle and squalor of the life of that time disappeared. And with it, any chance of finding the true identity of the killer called Jack the Ripper also vanished. So the case, as ever, remains a mystery, a compelling one, as there are a whole school of ripperologists who are still working on the case. Who knows? Someday, the identity of Jack the Ripper may yet be unmasked.